In this video, we're going to be covering rigor and relevance and what that looks like inside of a classroom, how student learning and the motivation given by teachers helps create a culture for learning and helps motivate students to drive and do better with higher expectations. The topics discussed in this video are going to be rigor and relevance framework, so an overview of the information, rigor and relevance outcomes, what that looks like after we put the framework into a lesson, and then finally rigor and relevance framework with technology. How can we take a lesson used in a classroom every day and add technology to it and not make it watered down but give it more of a push? How can we invoke student thinking with technology? Before we begin talking about any lesson with the rigor and relevance framework, we're going to go ahead and discuss some of these topics and these words so we all have the same mindset. The first word, rigor, is where work is given or a structured, developed plan is given to students to help challenge them, to help bring them to a different type of framework. In science, the word rigor generally means strong or very concrete, very stiff. And so that's the same idea when we talk about lessons. Are these lessons strong enough? Are they stiff enough to help motivate students without scaring them? Relevance is the idea that the information pertains to a student's life. If you've ever noticed, when you relate information to students, they tend to want to do it more. For example, if I am a math teacher and I'm teaching about statistics and I notice I have an athlete in my room who's really good at playing baseball, I may be more inclined to teach statistics using baseball. That seems to help them put their own mind framework around what they're learning. So when we talk about the rigor and relevance framework, we're using this model to help develop lessons that will help students achieve greater and greater goals. There are 4 different quadrants when it comes to the rigor and relevance framework. None of these quadrants are more important than the other. While we want our lessons to be in the D quadrant, not all of them can be, and nor should they be, because before we can get to the D quadrant of adaptation, we must have a baseline. For example, all students need to have a proper understanding of vocabulary before we can expect them to adapt that vocabulary in their everyday lives. So all of these quadrants are important. If you look at the bottom here, you'll see a bunch of numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the horizontal and vertical lines. Those are a brief explanation of where a student should be. As you progress farther from 1, going to the greater numbers, you'll see that there is a little more expectation for the students. When teachers use this framework, they're generally ranking their lesson on where they deem this lesson to be, where they would think student learning is happening. So for example, if I were to give a worksheet that was just basic vocabulary and ask students to define all the words, that's going to leave me in the quadrant A, acquisition. So how are these students acquiring this information? Is the teacher providing these definitions, or is the student expected to look them up? How are they using this vocabulary? Are they just blankly copying it? Are they expected to use it in their everyday conversations? What is going on? Many times, quadrant A is a basic recall of information. So checking to see what students already know, how can a teacher do a lesson and already start relating it to a student as they're learning it the first time. Check to see what students know. A good example would be students know that gold is an element. Quadrant B, application, is being able to use information given in class and apply it to a situation. So application, very basic. I'm going to apply what I know into this particular situation that you have given me. So an example, if we continue on with our gold idea, is finding the density of an object that looks like gold and determining if the object is gold or not. So would it be fool's gold if it's not gold? If you already notice, application is a lot more in-depth than acquisition. Students are expected to do a little bit more. So no, I'm not just giving them a formula. I am now telling them, use this formula and tell me if this is gold or not. Quadrant C, assimilation, is the higher order thinking that requires students to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate various scenarios. So now we're looking at different verbs that they must do in order to prove that that lesson is at that particular quadrant. An example here would be analyze the difference and similarities between fool's gold and gold and determine how both are important in science. Quadrant D, adaptation. Truly, this is where we want our students to fully show us that they understand a subject. So if you only have one lesson within your whole unit that is quadrant D, that lesson may have taken you weeks to develop in order to check for student understanding. Adaptation is the overall end goal of where we want our students. So how can this information be taken to fix real world problems? Example, fool's gold is a byproduct of geothermal energy. How can the properties of fool's gold be used in the modern world? Infrastructure, landscape, chemically, etc., etc. The lesson discussed in this video will be a genetics lesson taught using probability. This is given to all 10th grade students because biology is a required course for sophomores. When you look at this picture, you'll notice that there are differences and similarities to the picture before. Now, rather than having the words assimilation, adaptation, we are now putting these words into what it actually looks like in the classroom. So if you'll notice in quadrant A, teacher works, quadrant B, student works, quadrant C, student thinks, quadrant D, student works and thinks. So as we progress up the scale, the teacher is now moving towards the background and the student is now leading the way. So they are expected to understand the terms that the teacher gave in quadrant A and then take those terms and begin to frame their own thinking. So again, rigor and relevance. How can we make assignments that are tough and motivate a student but not scare them? How do we still relate those and keep this culture of wanting to learn, of wanting to be involved, and of wanting to really help motivate change? Because if we know anything about the classroom as teachers, we are not teaching to pass classes. We are teaching so that these students can go on into the real world and help find solutions to real world problems. That is how we need to make our lessons so that students aren't just getting an A and passing our class, but they're taking that information, taking that type of thinking and being able to proceed on and not look at a problem and think this is hard, think this is tough, but I need to start from the bottom and work my way up. Maybe I need somebody here to help me. Teachers need to scaffold, provide that development, but and provide confidence so that a student can go on to learn to work and think on their own. As I mentioned on the slide prior, I will be discussing a genetics lesson. So in this lesson, I'm going to take these quadrants and I'm going to explain what I do for this particular lesson, how to get students prepared to actually do this lesson, how I would rank this particular lesson on the rigor and relevance framework scale. I would probably say this is more of a B quadrant. So when we talk about the C and D quadrant, I'm going to go ahead and give you ideas on how I would get there, how we can make the assignment more tough as we go on. And it is important to note that your one lesson may just be a B quadrant lesson, and that's okay. You could have 5 different lessons and they all lead up to your D lesson. So A, teacher works. Typically in my classroom, because I have a flipped classroom, I am very lucky to have students that already come in with information, and they come in with the information because I provide that to them. So if we were to do this probability lesson on Tuesday, on either Friday or Monday prior, I would have provided a video with basic genetic vocabulary and examples of what this would look like on non-humans. When we start talking about genetics, we talk about it from a non-human perspective, and then we lead into human genetics. Because of the difficulties of human genetics, I try and keep it as simple as possible. So students have already watched a video with my flipped classroom layout. They come in, they already have the notes. So what we do is then we talk about it, we discuss it, and it's not a lecture. It is more of a very open discussion where students and I provide a framework. So every single one of my biology periods is a little different because I have different students in there. So rather than talk about how genetics looks with plants, I may talk about how genetics looks with animals depending on the students. We live in a very rural area, so some students are really interested in corn genetics, while other students are very interested in cows and cow genetics. So it's very easy for me to manipulate the information based off my students. So that's where the teacher works. Quadrant B, where the student works, and here is where this assignment I feel ranks. Students are given a probability assignment, and so what they need to do is they determine the probability of random events happening. And what they're going to find is that random events are not the cause of, oh, we're really lucky, or oh, it has to land on 6 if I roll this dice because it hasn't landed on 6 yet. They'll soon find that the probabilities are always the same. It's a 1 in 6 chance that we are going to get a 6, and you could very possibly get a 6 every single time. I use this assignment to represent genetics because I do not like when students come in saying it is guaranteed that my little brother is going to have curly hair because we all have curly hair. The idea of genetics and its randomness are so present within every single trait you see that I really want to use it. I want to start teaching it on a much easier way to see it. It's really hard to teach human genetics because there's so many possibilities. But if we take that information and we put it to a deck of cards, or we put it to a roulette wheel, or dice, flipping a coin, or dice, or anything like that, it's easier to see. Pulling colors out of a hat. The chances of you pulling red out are going to be greater if there's more colors in there versus if there's less colors. So that's how we start that. And students, they end up using the vocabulary that we had already taught in lesson A. As I've said already, I believe that this lesson that I'm giving is a B lesson that students are working, but they're not fully capturing their full capability. They can be thinking more. So how I would extend this lesson is I would go ahead and ask them to explain why this statement is not accurate. The roulette ball has hit black 3 times. It is now guaranteed to roll red next. So now they're taking the information they've learned from this assignment of probability, that it's random, that it is guaranteed to happen the same time every single time, even though it seems unlikely, even though I even go to explain to students that casinos really take the idea of luck and they use it to their advantage to tell students or to tell people when they're gambling that yes, it has to happen, but no, the probability is always the same, no matter what. Now, how could we make this lesson even more rigorous, even more relevant to a student? So let's take that thinking and move it over to quadrant D, where the student works and thinks. This is where I would then have students work in groups of 2 or 3 and create a short TikTok video. I realize that TikTok is relatively new, but it seems to be a huge hit, and I am going to incorporate it into my science classroom this year. I feel like it's just a new way to reach out to students. They also are very good at TikTok, more so better than some dedication to some subjects in the classes. So I thought, why not take the opportunity to involve TikTok in my classroom? So I'd have them create a TikTok video explaining why the chances of an offspring inheriting a trait are larger compared to randomly inheriting it. Again, we're avoiding the human inheritance for the beginning, but they can talk about how white plants are more likely to be white plants if both of their parents are white versus a purple plant. Having 2 purple plants mate and then have a purple plant is more likely than having a white plant. So they just need to explain that using the information they've already gathered from A, B, and C quadrants. So now they are working to develop the idea using some type of framework, which in this case is TikTok, and they're going to use all of their vocabulary, tie it all together. As I've explained before, I have a flipped classroom. So I would say I'm relatively decent at using technology in my classroom. I do not like the idea of using technology because we have it. I feel like it really does need to add to the class, not just be another hindrance. So I fully support one-to-one teaching when used properly. If we're just going to have a laptop and all we do is use it for the online textbook, that's not a good use of our time, and it's not justifiable to have that technology. But if you use technology to offer lessons, to offer various resources, to have students help create code, to have students help create videos that could very well go on YouTube and really help explain to other students. That's another project I've been working on, having students create their own lessons that they would give to other students to help them develop. Typically, a lot of students can teach their classmates a little easier because they are using the same vernacular. They're on the same level, if you will. Now, how would technology be used within my lesson? So I broke my lesson down using this scale to show you what that would look like. So again, the A quadrant is the most lowest level, so what the basic things students need in order to get going in the lesson. This is where I give the flipped classroom video, the vocabulary work, the basics of being able to define the words, knowing what the words mean before being able to move on. We also have an in-class discussion where we really just sit and talk about what this looks like. Again, the discussion is not lectured. It's more of just a facilitated conversation between students and the teacher. Application, so the probability activity, that's where the application goes in. Vocabulary is applied. Students are seeing basic probability in a smaller scale to understand how we could take that probability idea and move it forward into genetics and inheritance, the randomness of that. Assimilation, so now students would play roulette games to prove the statement wrong. Remember, the statement was that a roulette wheel is guaranteed to hit red because it's been hitting black this entire time. So how are they going to prove that statement wrong? They have evidence now. They're gathering evidence using technology. Very easily, they could go and look up statistics on the chances of hitting red versus hitting black. Is it 50% or is it more or less? And then they would compare those results to other students in the class. Are other students agreeing or disagreeing with the statement? And then finally, adaptation. They're using TikTok to make informative videos on probability and genetics. They are now taking all that information they've gathered and they are forwarding it onto the real world and perhaps maybe even solving issues on why is this plant disease always inherited 3 generations later? What could we do in the first generation to stop the disease from spreading? Why is it showing up in the 3rd generation instead of the 2nd or the 1st? So a few things to consider there. Overall, rigor and relevance and the framework is really just a guideline to help teachers determine what they can do more of to check for student understanding. Because if a student is able to regurgitate what I said to them, but they can't explain how they could use that in the real world, have they really learned anything? Because what that shows me is they've learned to memorize what I want to hear, but they have not learned to think about the issue. Until we can promote students to think about the issues and solve those issues, they have not truly learned anything. So once they are in the critical thinking, the evaluating, the analyzing, then we can fully say that they are able and ready to tackle on these tough lessons. I will be attaching my PowerPoint to this assignment. So if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.